Hello and welcome. I'm so glad you've decided to join me again for another quiet journey. Perhaps you've just settled into your favorite armchair, or maybe you're letting the silence of the night wrap around you. Wherever you are, I hope you feel entirely at ease. Tonight, we won't be visiting imposing castles or ancient ruins. Instead, we're opening the door to the quiet museum, a place where the past is preserved not in grand statues, but in the most ordinary objects of our daily lives. We'll whisper the secrets they hold. If you find peace in these soft-spoken histories, remember to subscribe. Your presence here makes this quiet storytelling possible. The Invisible Killer in the Sugar Bowl. Tonight, we begin our exploration not with gold or jewels, but with something you likely have sitting right now on your kitchen counter. Sugar. Sugar. It is pure, white, crystalline, a symbol of sweetness, celebration, and energy. It is the simple pleasure that finishes a morning coffee or sweetens a holiday dessert. But the truly astonishing thing about this beautiful, innocent substance is that for over 200 years, it was perhaps the single most brutal commodity in human history. It fueled empires, it started wars, and it was built upon a foundation of suffering so vast it is almost impossible to comprehend. We are going to explore the forgotten story of sugar, the extraordinary lengths humanity went to just to taste sweetness, and why, for a time, a small bowl of white crystals represented the absolute pinnacle of human cruelty. The white gold, origins and the fatal seed. Before sugar became cheap and ubiquitous, it was a rare luxury. In the early medieval period, it was so precious that it was classified alongside spices and medicines, reserved only for royalty and the very wealthy. To acquire a pound of it was a status symbol. The sugarcane plant itself is a marvel. Native to the warm, humid climates of Southeast Asia, it is a grass that stores an astonishing amount of sucrose. But to extract that sweetness, to turn that hard, fibrous stalk into glittering crystals, is a process of grueling, intense labor. It demands heat, moisture, and, above all else, unrelenting human effort. The true tragedy begins with its introduction to the New World in the 15th and 16th centuries. Explorers, realizing that the climate of the Caribbean and South America was perfectly suited to grow the cane, saw an opportunity, not just for profit, but for unimaginable, limitless wealth. Growing cane is backbreaking work. It requires constant clearing, planting, and weeding in tropical heat. And the harvest, the crop time, is a frantic, desperate race against the clock. The cane must be processed immediately after cutting to prevent the sugar from degrading. The entire process was brutally demanding. The solution chosen by European powers, the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Dutch, the English, was a tragedy of a staggering scale. They would build vast, industrial sugar plantations, and they would staff them with enslaved people forcibly taken from Africa. This decision turned what should have been a simple agricultural product into the driving engine of the transatlantic slave trade. Sugar became the white gold of the New World, purchased at an unspeakable price. The sugar mill. The jaws of death. The sheer brutality of the sugar plantation system is almost clinical in its horror. It was a factory of death operating under the relentless tropical sun. The most dangerous place on the entire plantation was the sugar mill, the place where the cane stalk was crushed to release the sweet juice. The mills were often powered by water, wind, or oxen, turning huge iron rollers. The job of feeding the heavy cane stalks into these rollers was given to the enslaved workers. The work demanded absolute, unrelenting focus, often running 24 hours a day during the crop time harvest. Sleep deprivation was constant. The heat and humidity were suffocating, the air thick with the smell of cut cane and raw sugar. And the rollers were completely unforgiving. If a worker's hand or arm was accidentally caught in the crushing rollers, and this was a common occurrence due to sheer exhaustion, the only way to save the worker's life was to immediately chop off the arm with a machete. There was no time to stop the mill. The flow of sweetness, the flow of profit, could not be interrupted. Planters called the mills the jaws of death. This wasn't a metaphor. It was an accepted reality. The historian B.W. Higman noted that the life expectancy of an enslaved person on a sugar plantation was so tragically short that the system constantly required new infusions of human cargo simply to maintain production levels. It was a system that consumed human lives faster than it could replace them. The invisible killer in the sugar bowl was accelerated death. Once crushed, the juice had to be boiled. This was the second circle of the sugar hell, the boiler room. The raw sugar juice was poured into a series of massive copper kettles called coppers, arranged in a line over roaring wood-fueled fires. The liquid would be moved from one kettle to the next, heating it more intensely each time, until the water evaporated and the sugar crystals began to form. The smell inside the boiler room was overwhelming, a thick mix of boiling sugar, molasses, and smoke. The heat was beyond suffocating. Workers, often stripped naked due to the intense temperatures, constantly stirred the thick, molten liquid, risking falls into the boiling sugar. A fall into a copper was an unimaginable way to die. Boiling sugar reaches temperatures much higher than boiling water. It instantly sticks to the skin, causing deep, severe burns that rarely allowed for survival. It was a terrifying, deliberate death trap built for efficiency. The irony is that the final product, the gleaming white sugar, was often only extracted through further cruel processes, sometimes using animal blood or ash to filter the impurities. When you look at a bowl of white sugar today, you are looking at the end product of a three-step manufacturing process that was arguably the most dangerous, exhausting, and dehumanizing industrial labor in the 17th and 18th centuries. Pause. Let the weight of the last sentence settle. The silent cost of sweetness. The brutality of sugar wasn't just physical. It was psychological, social, and global. The massive profits generated by white gold became the foundation of European mercantile empires. Cities like Bristol, London, and Amsterdam were built and financed on the back of sugar wealth. Sugar was so valuable that it dictated foreign policy and fueled colonial wars between Britain, France, and Spain over control of the Caribbean islands. The final insidious impact of sugar was how it silently contributed to the normalization of suffering. As sugar became cheaper, it became an everyday addition to the diets of European working classes. They drank sweetened tea and coffee, products that simultaneously distracted them from their own hard labor and subtly connected them to the horrific machinery of the Caribbean. The consumption of sweetness was paid for by the permanent bitterness of millions of enslaved lives. The invisible killer in the sugar bowl was not a toxin, but moral compromise. Long pause. We've only just begun to scratch the surface of the secrets hidden in the ordinary objects around us. Next time, we will leave the heat of the Caribbean and move to the smoky parlors of Victorian England to uncover the dark secret lurking behind the seemingly simple act of reading a letter. Good night, and rest well knowing the stories of the past are now gently laid to rest. Hello again. I'm glad you could return to the Quiet Museum. Last time, we left the heat of the Caribbean sugar plantations, where sweetness came at an unbearable cost. Tonight, we move to a different kind of chamber, one where the cost wasn't paid in physical exhaustion, but in madness and slow, agonizing death. We are going to open the door to a world of reflection. The mirror, a window to the soul, a doorway to madness. Look around you now. I suspect you can find at least one mirror nearby, perhaps hanging on a wall or resting in your hand, reflected in the glass of your phone. It is a simple object, a plane of glass that captures light and faithfully shows you you. We use them for vanity, for utility, for light. We treat them as harmless windows into the immediate present. But for centuries, the mirror was one of the most dangerous, sought after, and secretive objects in the world. It was linked to incredible wealth, international espionage, and a slow, invisible poison that ate away at the minds and bodies of the men who made them. The secret lurking behind the mirror's beautiful, clear reflection is mercury. Murano's golden secret. For a long time, mirrors were simply polished metal, dark, dull, and distorted. But in the 16th century, the city-state of Venice, specifically the glass-making island of Murano, perfected the true, clear mirror, the one we recognize today. This invention was not just glass-making, it was alchemy. The Venetians achieved this perfect reflection using a process called tin-mercury amalgam. Here's how the process worked. A sheet of tinfoil was carefully spread across a smooth marble table. Liquid mercury, that shimmering, silvery metal that fascinated the medieval world, was then poured liberally over the tin. The mercury would chemically bond with the tin, creating a reflective metallic paste. The glass sheet would then be gently lowered onto this molten, deadly paste. The glass was pressed down, and the excess mercury was squeezed out and collected. The final glass sheet, now brilliantly reflective, was then left to set for weeks or even months. The result was stunning. These mirrors were so clear, so perfect, they were instantly dubbed mirrors of the truth. Kings and queens paid fortunes for them. They became the ultimate status symbol, often commanding prices higher than a Renaissance painting or a warship. The poison in the workshop. The genius of the Venetian process was unmatched, but the cost was paid by the men who worked in the Murano workshops, the speciai, the mirror makers. The process of working with liquid mercury requires constant, intense contact. The workers breathed mercury vapor, which is highly toxic and easily absorbed through the skin. Mercury doesn't leave the body easily. It accumulates, slowly attacking the nervous system. The symptoms were subtle at first. Shaking hands, often called the Hatter's Shakes, or Mad Hatter disease, a condition we now associate with mercury poisoning in the felt industry. The hands of the mirror makers, meant to handle delicate glass, became unreliable, trembling constantly. Then came the psychological toll. Victims suffered from profound mood swings, irritability, anxiety, and eventually mercurial madness, a state of paranoia, confusion, and terrifying hallucinations. They were literally being poisoned into insanity by the very reflections they created. In the workshops of Murano, the price of vanity was the sanity of the craftsman. The conspiracy of silence. The Venetian state knew exactly how deadly this process was. They realized that if the secret of the silvering process escaped Murano, their monopoly and their vast fortune would collapse. So, they enforced a strict, deadly policy. The Specii were essentially prisoners on the island. They were extremely well paid, treated like royalty within the compound, but they were forbidden from leaving, often under the penalty of death. If a mirror maker tried to escape and sell the secret to France or England, the Venetian secret police, the Council of Ten, would hunt them down. The execution of the deserter would be public and brutal. This created a horrific paradox. The Venetian mirror makers were guarded not just against foreign competitors, but against their own desperation and illness. As mercury slowly destroyed their nervous systems, they were trapped in a gilded cage, creating beautiful reflections for a world they could never truly join. The secret was finally stolen by industrial espionage in the late 17th century, but by then, the Venetian mirror makers had endured centuries of quiet suffering. The legacy of reflection. The next time you glance into a mirror, remember its secret life. Remember the brilliance of the reflection was bought not just with glass, but with the tremors and madness of the Specii of Murano. The invisible killer in the mirror was not just mercury, but the price of vanity and the human greed for the perfect, flawless image. We leave the secretive glass workshops tonight. Next time, we move to the smoky parlors of Victorian England to uncover the dark secret lurking behind the seemingly simple act of reading a letter. We'll discuss the poison of anonymity and the rise of the terrifying art of blackmail. Good night, and rest well, knowing the stories of the past are now gently laid to rest. Hello again. I'm glad we can share this time together once more. Last time, we examined the beautiful, deadly secret of the mirror, reflecting the slow poisoning endured by the Venetian mirror makers. Tonight, we turn our attention to an object that carries not mercury, but something far more volatile: words. We are going to enter the Victorian world, a time of strict social codes, hidden desires, and the terrifying rise of the anonymous letter. The letter, a poisoned pen. Think of the simple act of receiving a letter. A familiar handwriting, a cheerful stamp, the crisp sound of the paper tearing open. It suggests connection, news, affection. But in the 19th century, particularly after the reforms of the British Postal Service, the letter became something else entirely. It became the perfect vessel for silent malice. Before 1840, sending a letter was expensive. The cost was usually paid by the receiver, and that cost varied wildly depending on the distance. This expense acted as a natural barrier to frivolous or harmful correspondence. Then came the penny post reform of 1840, masterminded by Sir Rowland Hill. For the price of a single penny, anyone could send a letter anywhere in the United Kingdom, paid for in advance by the sender. This was a profound step forward for democracy and education, but it also had a devastating unintended consequence: the perfect concealment of the author. The penny post revolutionized communication, but it also democratized a terrifying form of violence, anonymous psychological warfare. The Golden Age of Malice. The Victorian era was a time defined by reputation. Your place in society, your livelihood, your marriage, everything depended on maintaining a facade of respectability. A single whispered accusation could destroy a life, and the anonymous letter was the perfect tool for whispering. The attacker didn't need a sword or a gun. All they needed was a pen and a penny stamp. They could accuse a wife of infidelity, a businessman of fraud, or a politician of corruption, all without ever facing a consequence. These were not just childish pranks. These letters were meticulously crafted, often citing true but highly embarrassing personal details designed to inflict maximum psychological damage. They thrived on the immense pressure of Victorian social conformity. The police were often powerless. Handwriting was easy to disguise, and the sheer volume of mail meant that tracking down the writer was nearly impossible. The anonymous writer held perfect, untouchable power over the victim. The anonymous letter found its deadliest purpose in the form of blackmail. Blackmail is not just about money. It is about the cold, calculated exploitation of shame. It is the selling of silence. As wealth grew and social mobility increased in the Victorian period, so did the potential for secrets. Affairs, debts, past indiscretions, these became high-value commodities in the criminal underworld. The letters would begin quietly, a subtle threat, a vague reference to a past mistake. Then the demand would arrive, cold and clear, often accompanied by a detailed description of the secret, confirming the writer knew everything. The victims, wealthy merchants, military officers, and especially married women, were trapped. Going to the police meant exposing the secret anyway. They were forced into a terrifying, ongoing relationship with an unseen predator who controlled their lives through fear. Historians note that for a period in the late 19th century, blackmail epidemics swept through major cities like London, preying on the very respectability that society demanded. It was a societal wound inflicted by the simplest of objects, a cheap piece of paper. The psychological toll. The letters created a unique form of psychological torture. Imagine receiving a letter that threatens to expose your entire life, but you don't know who wrote it. It could be a servant, a colleague, a jealous neighbor, or even a relative. The victim was forced to look at every person around them with suspicion. Every smile became a mask. Every polite inquiry felt like a trap. This constant paranoia often led to severe mental breakdown, isolation, and, tragically, suicide. The renowned psychologist H.B. Fearon wrote that the anonymous blackmailer was a creature who destroyed peace of mind without ever appearing in the flesh. The weapon was purely psychological, yet its effect was devastatingly physical. The invisible killer in the letter was not poison, but the toxic power of anonymity. The legacy of anonymity. Today, the physical letter has largely been replaced by email and social media, but the poison remains. The anonymous attack, the secret threat, the public shaming. These dangers have simply changed vessels, moving from the penny post to the digital screen. The anxiety is the same. The quiet lesson of the Victorian letter is that every tool designed for connection can be weaponized for cruelty. We leave the secretive parlors of Victorian England tonight. Next time, we travel to the vast, turbulent oceans to explore a simple beverage that caused 2 continents to go to war: tea. We'll discuss the brutal origins of the Opium Wars. Good night, and rest well, knowing the stories of the past are now gently laid to rest. Hello again. It is good to share this quiet space with you once more. Last time, we explored the silent psychological poison carried by the anonymous Victorian letter. Tonight, we turn to a far more global object, one that begins innocently in a delicate porcelain cup, but whose history stained the oceans with blood. We are going to steep ourselves in the history of tea. Tea, the empire's obsession. For most people, tea is warmth, comfort, routine, a civilized break in a busy day. In Britain, particularly, the ritual of afternoon tea became the very backbone of social structure and national identity. But this simple, soothing beverage was not merely a drink. It was a national addiction. And this addiction created an economic imbalance so vast that the greatest empire in the world resorted to drug trafficking and war to satisfy its craving. Before the 19th century, virtually all the tea consumed in Europe came exclusively from China. The Chinese held the monopoly on the cultivation and processing of the finest leaves. The problem for the British Empire was simple, yet economically catastrophic. The Chinese didn't want anything Britain produced. The Chinese prized their own goods, silk, porcelain, and above all, tea. They demanded payment only in silver. As the British appetite for tea exploded, with imports skyrocketing from a few £1,000s a year to millions, the balance of payments tilted wildly. Silver flowed out of Britain and into China at an alarming rate. The British treasury was being drained. The addiction of the entire empire was creating a national financial crisis. The search for a substitute. The East India Company, the powerful trading entity that managed Britain's affairs in Asia, faced a terrifying dilemma. Either find a substitute for tea, or find a substitute for silver. Their first attempt was technological espionage, sending agents like the famous Robert Fortune to disguise themselves and sneak into the remote Chinese interior to steal tea seeds and the secrets of tea production. They would try to transplant the industry to their colony in India. This theft of intellectual property was crucial, but cultivating Indian tea took decades to perfect and distribute. The immediate problem of the draining silver reserve remained. The solution they settled upon was simple, devastating, and morally indefensible. The British had access to a highly addictive narcotic grown in their vast Indian territories, opium. The East India Company began smuggling massive quantities of raw opium from India into China. They sold the drug illegally to Chinese merchants for silver, and then used that silver to buy the tea that was shipped back to Britain. This created a perfect, brutal, triangular trade, Opium flowed from India to China, silver flowed from China to India and then to Britain, and tea flowed from China to Britain. The British solved their financial crisis, but they triggered a human disaster. Opium addiction exploded across China, affecting millions of people, from peasants to high-ranking officials. It crippled the Chinese economy and its society. The invisible killer in the teacup was not a toxin, but systemic drug trafficking enforced by an empire. The inevitable war. The Chinese imperial court could not ignore the devastation. They pleaded, then demanded that the British stop the illegal opium trade. When the demands were ignored, the Chinese acted. In 1839, Commissioner Lin Zexu confiscated and destroyed massive stockpiles of British-owned opium in Canton. Britain's response was swift and terrible. They did not defend their drug trafficking on moral grounds. They defended it as an attack on free trade and British commercial rights. This financial addiction led directly to the First Opium War, 1839 to 1842. The war was completely one-sided. Britain's superior steam-powered naval technology easily crushed the outdated Chinese forces. The war was fought purely to force China to accept the importation of opium and pay indemnities. The peace treaties that followed, known as the unequal treaties, forced China to open its ports and, most famously, cede the island of Hong Kong to the British. The next time you enjoy a calming cup of tea, remember its quiet history. Remember that the soothing comfort you feel was purchased with the silver that funded the drug trade, and that the stability of the British Empire was built upon the addiction and humiliation of an entire nation. The pursuit of a simple daily pleasure, the warmth of the teacup, led directly to massive geopolitical conflict and a human tragedy that echoed for over a century. We leave the stormy seas of the Opium Wars tonight. Next time, we move to Central America to explore a beloved object that began its life as a religious ritual, but became tainted by forced labor and the bitter bean: chocolate. Good night, and rest well, knowing the stories of the past are now gently laid to rest. Hello again. Thank you for joining me for another quiet descent into the past. Last time, we witnessed how the simple pleasure of tea fueled the destructive opium wars. Tonight, we turn to a deeper, richer indulgence, one that began as a sacred ritual and ended as a bitter symbol of exploitation: chocolate. Chocolate, the drink of the gods. Today, chocolate is everywhere. A comforting treat, a simple bar, a gesture of affection. But for thousands of years, the cacao bean was far from a sweet confection. For the Mayan and Aztec civilizations of Mesoamerica, it was a profound, powerful object. Cacao was not eaten, it was drunk. It was often mixed with chili, cornmeal, or vanilla to create a bitter, frothy beverage called xocolotl. This drink was reserved for warriors, royalty, and high priests. It was used in religious ceremonies, in rituals of sacrifice, and as medicine. It was literally considered the food of the gods. Furthermore, the cacao bean was so valuable that it served as currency. You could buy a rabbit with 10 beans or an enslaved person with 100. The beans represented power, wealth, and spiritual significance. This was the quiet, sacred world the Spanish conquistadors stumbled into in the 16th century. The conquest of the bean. When Hernán Cortés and his forces encountered the Aztec Empire, they quickly realized the staggering value of the cacao bean. They didn't initially care for the bitter taste of xocolotl, but they certainly understood its worth as a commodity. The Spanish quickly adapted the drink to their own palates. They removed the chilies and began adding cane sugar, the very commodity we discussed in Part 1, cinnamon, and milk. They transformed the ritualistic Aztec beverage into a sweet, highly addictive European luxury. Chocolate soon became a sensation among European royalty and aristocracy, known for its exotic flavor and purported aphrodisiac qualities. The demand for the new sweet drug exploded across the continent. But just as with sugar, cultivating the cacao plant was brutally labor-intensive. The trees are delicate, the pods must be harvested individually, and the fermentation and drying processes are exacting. To meet Europe's insatiable sweet tooth, the Spanish were forced to turn the lands they conquered into massive production zones. The native populations, ravaged by European diseases and forced labor, quickly dwindled. The conquistadors then established a system of plantations and imported enslaved people, first from other parts of the New World and later directly from Africa, to work the cacao fields. The legacy of forced labor initiated by the Spanish became an indelible part of the chocolate trade for centuries. By the 19th and early 20th centuries, as chocolate became accessible to the middle class, production shifted increasingly to West Africa. The demand for cheap cocoa led to horrific abuses, particularly in the Portuguese colonies of São Tomé and Príncipe. Journalists and human rights activists documented that the cocoa industry there was overwhelmingly dependent on a system that was effectively slavery by another name. Workers were forced to labor for years with no pay and no ability to leave, separated permanently from their families. The invisible killer in the chocolate bar was not a natural poison, but the systemic consumption of human freedom for profit. The modern stain. Though many modern companies have pledged to eliminate child labor and modern slavery from their supply chains, the bitter shadow of exploitation still haunts the cocoa industry today. The demand for the cheapest possible chocolate continues to incentivize desperate, illegal labor practices in West African nations, particularly Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana, which produce the majority of the world's cocoa. The journey of the cacao bean from a sacred currency reserved for the gods to a commodity that fuels anonymous suffering in modern times is perhaps one of the most tragic transformations in the history of food. The cost of that sweet bite is still paid, often by the smallest and most vulnerable hands. We leave the humid cocoa plantations tonight. Next time, we move forward in time to the smoky factories of the early 20th century to explore a silent, glowing object that promised modernity but instead delivered agony. We will look at the clock and the tragic story of the Radium Girls. Good night, and rest well knowing the stories of the past are now gently laid to rest. Hello again. Welcome back to the hushed halls of the Quiet Museum. We've traveled from the plantations of the Caribbean to the parlors of Victorian England. Tonight, we move into the early 20th century, a time of electrifying speed, modern industry, and a blind faith in science. Our object tonight is the symbol of modernity itself, the clock. More specifically, the silent, glowing face of the wristwatch. The glowing promise of radium. In the 1910s and 1920s, the wristwatch was essential, particularly as men went to war and industry demanded punctuality. But how could soldiers and factory workers read time in the dark? The answer came in a revolutionary, newly discovered element: radium. Radium had been discovered by Marie and Pierre Curie and was celebrated as a miracle. It was thousands of times more radioactive than uranium, and its most mesmerizing property was its permanent ethereal glow. It required no external light source. It shone by its own atomic power. Manufacturers quickly realized radium's potential. They mixed it into paint and used it to coat the dials, numbers, and hands of watches, creating timepieces that glowed with a silent, ghostly green light. This was not just utility, it was magic. The watches were sold as the ultimate status symbol, representing scientific progress and reliability. The problem, however, was that the people applying this miracle paint had no idea they were handling a deadly, invisible poison. The Radium Girls, an invisible killer. The work of applying the radium paint was deemed delicate and precise, and it was primarily performed by young women in factories across the United States. These women were known as the Radium Girls. They were told the paint, a mixture of zinc sulfide and radium, was entirely safe. They were encouraged to be precise, as radium was expensive. To achieve the finest point on their tiny paintbrushes for the delicate numbers, the supervisors taught the girls a technique: lip pointing. The girls were instructed to put the brush tip between their lips, moisten it, and then refine the point before touching the watch face. Every time they did this, they ingested a microscopic but lethal dose of radium. They thought it was harmless. Some girls even painted their fingernails and teeth with the glowing substance for fun, turning themselves into living, silent spectacles in the darkness. But the ingested radium was silently destroying them. Radium is chemically similar to calcium. When ingested, the body mistakes it for calcium and sends it straight to the bones. Once there, the radium atoms, with a half-life of 1,600 years, began a relentless, microscopic bombardment of the bone marrow. The initial symptoms were dismissed as anemia or simple exhaustion, fatigue, aching joints, and persistent dental problems. Then came the grotesque horrors. Their jaws began to decay, crumbling from within in a condition known as radium necrosis. Their leg bones, their spines, the very scaffolding of their bodies slowly disintegrated. The invisible killer in the clock was an atomic poison that literally ate away the women's bones from the inside. When one of the girls, Amelia Maggia, died in 1922, her doctors could not identify the cause. It would take years of relentless, agonizing illness and death before the connection between the glowing paint and the dying girls was made undeniable. The silent fight for justice. The company fought the girls' claims ruthlessly, spending years in court denying any link between the radium and the deaths. They even bribed doctors to provide false testimony. But the women, led by pioneers like Grace Fryer, refused to be silenced. Though their bodies were failing, their resolve was not. They became the first group of workers to truly fight for the right to know the dangers of their workplace. The legal battles of the Radium Girls were foundational. They established the right for individual workers to sue companies over occupational diseases and laid the groundwork for modern labor safety standards. Their sacrifice ensured that thousands of subsequent workers would be protected from invisible workplace hazards. The glowing, silent clock face, once a symbol of modernity, became an indelible marker of human sacrifice and the hidden cost of progress. The legacy of the hour. The next time you check your watch or glance at a clock, remember the tragic cost of illumination. Remember the young women who were poisoned by the very light they created. The quiet lesson of the Radium Girls is that we must never allow our faith in progress to override the fundamental human right to safety. We leave the glowing factories of the 1920s tonight. Next time, we explore a deadly, beautiful object that hung in the parlors of the wealthy and was worn at the finest balls: clothing dye. We'll discuss the fashion craze that killed with arsenic. Good night, and rest well, knowing the stories of the past are now gently laid to rest. Hello again. It is good to share this quiet evening with you. We've traveled through time, from the sugar plantations to the radium factories. Tonight, we look at something outwardly beautiful, something designed to attract the eye and signal wealth: color. Specifically, the vivid, fashionable dyes used in 19th century clothing and home decor. We are going to uncover the chilling story of the fashion trend that used an ancient, potent poison to achieve the perfect shade: arsenic green. The fashion of death: Scheele's green. In the early 19th century, chemical engineering was rapidly changing the world of fashion. Suddenly, colors that were once dull and fugitive, fading quickly, could be made dazzling, brilliant, and permanent. The most sensational color of this era was a brilliant, almost impossibly vivid shade of emerald or grass green. It was used everywhere: on ladies' ball gowns, men's waistcoats, children's toys, artificial flowers, and most dangerously, on wallpaper. This color was officially named Scheele's green or Paris green, and its vibrant intensity was achieved by a single, powerful ingredient: arsenic. Arsenic, as we know, is an ancient, potent poison, silent, tasteless, and highly lethal. But when mixed with copper acetate, it created the most stunning green the world had ever seen. The demand for this shade was insatiable. It was the color of nature, vitality, and wealth. The women who wore these dresses, the workers who made them, and the children who played in rooms painted this shade were unknowingly embracing a powerful, slow-acting killer. The unseen threat of the ballroom. The dresses themselves were death traps. When a woman wore an arsenic-dyed gown to a crowded, warm ballroom, the moisture from her sweat would interact with the dye. This chemical reaction released minute but steady quantities of arsenic compounds, which were then absorbed directly through her skin. Symptoms were vague and easily dismissed: rashes, skin irritation, headaches, and general malaise. Over time, chronic low-level arsenic poisoning would lead to hair loss, stomach problems, and nervous system damage. The air in the ballroom itself became toxic. As the dress fabric shifted, microscopic flakes of the arsenic-laced dye would shed, mixing with the dust. Everyone nearby, partners, onlookers, and especially the unfortunate maids tasked with brushing the dresses, would inhale the poison. One of the most tragic cases involved the industry of artificial flowers.
Young, often poor women were employed to assemble delicate green leaves and flowers, dusting them with powdered arsenic green pigment. The room would fill with the poisonous dust. These workers suffered the most severe symptoms: agonizing stomach pain, violent vomiting, and many died young, victims of the beautiful, deadly fashion. The walls that killed. Perhaps the most insidious application of arsenic green was in wallpaper. The brightly patterned green wallpapers were a sign of middle-class respectability. But when these wallpapers became damp, say in a poorly ventilated Victorian bedroom, a terrifying chemical reaction occurred.
Certain fungi and molds, thriving in the damp environment, would feed on the organic materials in the paper paste. During this process, they converted the arsenic compounds into a highly toxic, invisible gas called arsine. Arsine gas would silently fill the room. Residents would simply fall ill with chronic fatigue, fever, and breathing problems, all symptoms easily mistaken for a persistent cold or flu. Entire families suffered long-term illness, sometimes death, trapped within the walls of their beautifully decorated homes. It took years for scientists and doctors to connect the beautiful, fashionable color to the invisible poison permeating the home. The legacy of toxic beauty. The relentless pursuit of a vivid, perfect color led manufacturers to ignore the clear signs of sickness among their workers and customers. Like the radium companies, the dye manufacturers fiercely resisted the scientific evidence, prioritizing profit over human safety. The invisible killer in the beautiful dress was not the fabric itself, but the toxic ambition of an age that prioritized aesthetics over life. The quiet lesson of the arsenic green dye is that beauty can often disguise the deepest danger. We leave the luxurious but deadly parlors of the 19th century tonight. Our final journey will bring together all the threads of our exploration, from the sugar bowl to the poisoned clock, as we reflect on the ultimate cost of comfort and the enduring power of these lost objects in our modern world. Good night, and rest well, knowing the stories of the past are now gently laid to rest. Hello, for the final time in this series. We have reached the end of our quiet journey through the Quiet Museum. Thank you for walking with me through the dark reflections of the past, for enduring the silence of the factory floors, and for witnessing the hidden cost of the everyday objects we often take for granted. The assembly of the past. Tonight, let us briefly retrace our steps. Let us see how the separate threads of this story weave together to form a single, profound truth about human nature and the price of comfort. We began with sugar, the dazzling white crystal that tasted of purity, but whose sweetness was paid for by the horrific, life-consuming brutality of the jaws of death in the Caribbean mills. The lesson was about consumption and cost. We then looked into the mirror, the flawless reflection created by the brilliant glassmakers of Murano, whose nervous systems were slowly devoured by mercury, a silent tribute to human vanity and obsession with image. The lesson was about beauty and sacrifice. The humble letter showed us the psychological terror of the anonymous threat, revealing how the march of communication technology can be weaponized to inflict fear and shatter the fragile reputation of the Victorian age. The lesson was about connection and cruelty. The comforting ritual of tea revealed the vast economic engine of empire, fueled by the Opium Wars, a tragic cycle where national addiction led to state-sanctioned drug trafficking and the humiliation of a continent. The lesson was about desire and dominion. Chocolate taught us that even the food of the gods could not escape the taint of human exploitation, transforming from a sacred currency into a commodity built on forced labor, a stain that darkens its sweet taste even today. The lesson was about indulgence and injustice. The modern clock, glowing brightly with radium, showed us the ultimate betrayal. The young factory women who became literal martyrs to technological progress, their bones consumed by the very light they created for the world. The lesson was about progress and poison. And finally, the vivid green clothing dye reminded us that even the quest for fleeting fashion can be fatal, as high society embraced a beautiful arsenic pigment, killing both the makers and the wearers in their pursuit of the perfect color. The lesson was about aesthetics and annihilation. The price of quiet. These objects, the sugar, the mirror, the tea, the clock, were not inherently evil. They were simply tools. They were resources. They became instruments of terror only when filtered through the immense, unchecked machinery of human desire, political ambition, and the relentless pressure for profit. And rest well, knowing the secrets of the past are now gently laid to rest. The core secret that binds all these objects together is this: someone always pays the hidden cost for someone else's quiet comfort. The thickness of the beautiful green wallpaper, the flawless reflection of the glass, the quick convenience of the clock, all these small, quiet comforts demanded a vast, hidden expenditure of human health, freedom, and life. By rediscovering these lost stories, by acknowledging the brutal origins of the ordinary, we do not diminish the beauty of the objects. We simply honor the truth of the process. We recognize that our world, even in its quietest moments, is built upon a history that was anything but quiet. Final farewell. As we close the doors to the Quiet Museum tonight, I encourage you to carry these whispered stories with you. The world is filled with objects waiting to tell their true tales. Perhaps the history of your favorite coffee cup, the material in your curtains, or the metal in your keys holds a story just as profound, just as costly as the ones we've shared. Listen closely. The silence often speaks the loudest truth. Thank you for your attention, for your calm presence, and for sharing this thoughtful history. Your time here is appreciated more than you know. Good night.